I was so excited to teach this chapter. Actually, the way I read Ingold, although he'd probably kill me if he knew about it, is I got a copy of this book on a Kindle, and then I have Alexa read it to me as doing things. It's not exactly an audio book, and it makes Ingold sound like Alexa, which is bizarre, but that's the way he talks to me. And I was walking around Onion to live, our fine town, and thinking about the foundations and the sidewalks heaving and cracking. It's getting really excited. We are going to connect it to the last chapter, but we're going to do it via Tris Tropique by Claude Lévi-Strauss. I've told you about him before. He came up in structural anthropology. The guy who talked about the brain. Ingold's not into him, really. But he talked about when we're talking about the art thing and how the idea that your brain is working in your subconscious and controlling what you do, even though you don't know it. But he was very famous for structural anthropology, maybe the most famous anthropologist. We have Margaret Mead in the United States, but the global reach, I would have to say Claude Lévi-Strauss must be the most famous. And he wrote a book called Tris Tropique, which may be his best-selling book, but it's more like a travel novel. It's a travelogue. Has anybody read Tris Tropique? 1955 it was published, and yeah, it may be worth a read. Yeah, that's what we were talking about in the last classes, those monuments. And so here Ingold is citing Lévi-Strauss. This is from the last chapter, where he says that Lévi-Strauss claims that monuments and writing are the basis of civilization, and they're all supposed to be permanent. They're supposed to be there for all time. Of course, in the last class, we talked about how the monumental structures actually crack and crumble and don't really endure, but you're absolutely right that they are a symbol of, they are often, most often, especially the architectural, the building monuments, maybe not stone heads, but buildings, are meant to be about state power. And so in some way, no accident that also in this chapter, Ingold starts talking about the Greek and their ideas of what politics is and what the Greek polis entailed of on page 172. And it was assumed that in some ways, the Greeks lived on that funny little place like an archipelago. It's got little islands and stuff. And so they knew that they had to use the sea, but Ingold says that in Greek thought and with Plato and Aristotle, the politics and the basis of social life is assumed to be on land. That's where you're supposed to have everything. The sea is nice. You need it to bring things back and forth, but it's dangerous. In fact, I was very struck by this sentence from Aristotle. Even Aristotle, while stressing the importance of access to the sea for commerce, acknowledged that the influx of strangers caused by the sea's proximity can corrode good government. Influx of strangers can corrode good government. So this whole idea that you need to be on, that the land is what provides order, and the sea is this dangerous thing that's going to take away your actual, and probably take away your actual buildings, but it also brings in these weird people from afar, these strangers who are going to erode your good government. It strikes me we're living this assumption out again right now and all across the world, this idea that these strangers are coming in from the sea or across the borders and they're going to erode the foundations of good government. And so we talked about in the last class how it is also assumed that architecture is our projection of design onto the land. And that's where Ingold is dealing with in the last chapter, is dealing with the idea of the conical lodge, or what we might just call a teepee, but in this case, it's this caribou skinned lodge, which looks like architecture because it looks like what we imagine as something plopped onto the land. Of course, people are on land. We can't breathe underwater. Yeah, I know, Ingold knows that, but it's a whole political assumption as well. It's a whole assumption about where order and dwelling and human life belong, which is on permanent land. And then you said, oh, those architects, of course they know about digging in the earth. But they actually don't. They assume, and we assume. We look out, we go into Oneonta. I never thought about the basements of all those houses. You look out, and they look like houses just plopped on the land. Plunk, 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 plunk. They talked about houses driving down the road on 88. You'll pass houses being driven around to be plunked right under the land, just like that. Plunk.
Just like that?
Just like that. Plunk. But Ingold says the conical lodge is not actually architecture. And we talked about the dangers of assuming, and Lévi-Strauss was great about this, by the way. He was great about saying that in some ways, everyone has these structures of mind. At a time when people wanted to say that civilized mind was different from so-called primitive mind, Lévi-Strauss was wonderful about extending the structures of human mind as a universal to all societies. However, what we want to be careful of here is believing this in our quest to not be ethnocentric, in our quest to say that all people have architecture. We often project our architectural assumptions onto those of others, and we think that they are building conical lodges the same way that an architect designs an acropolis, but it's just a cultural form rather than an individual genius. Now, what did we find out though from the last class? What's the big lesson? I'm so excited about it. I may have forgotten what the big lesson was in the last class. What did we walk away with? Houses do need to be more like trees. Our buildings and our environment, that we are growing into them. And wait a second though, what world do we actually inhabit? What world does the conical lodge speak to? Ingold goes into the conical lodge, kneels on the ground, and looks at the sky and realizes, yes, John. The sky earth world. That the conical lodge is how that it draws in us as inhabitants into the earth sky world from which we are nourished and draw nourishment and all that wonderful stuff. And that, well, what do we want to be instead of peasants battling the earth? Nomads and mariners. And so we get a bunch of lessons from how the mariners and the nomads are working with the earth and working with the sea. And in this chapter, in some ways, for me, I'm starting to think maybe this is an extension of that last chapter. That's what I'm trying to convince you of. Because in some ways, what the last chapter was about is how we should not impose our assumptions of the world onto others. But in this case, we are taking the lessons of the people who actually are on the ocean, traversing the ocean or traversing the land, and bringing them back to our own society. Now, this all comes about when Ingold goes into an art show, and he goes to this David Lem art show called Debris and Phenomena. He's taken these discarded cartographic maps and then superimposed different things upon them. And then he gave them these things to go walk around the town of Edinburgh, I think. He's walking around the town and it's all windy. He's walking around, it's like a scavenger hunt almost. You have to find these things and then get your map stamped and you're recreating the artwork. It's very interactive. I should have made you guys do that. I should do that. I should have recreated this. Anyway, he's walking around and it's very windy, and all of a sudden he starts having this hallucination that his raincoat is a sail and that he's sailing along. That's the whole input for the chapter. It's epiphany after epiphany. That's what's so great about it. The first life started in water. That's exactly Ingold's point. Yes, it starts in the water, and only later, as the creatures get better at organizing themselves, they're able to get out onto the land. But Ingold's point is that here, these creatures are, it's like, actually, my biology teacher used to make this big big point about this. Our bodies are mostly water, and so we are basically walking creatures of the ocean now. But this whole point about the swimming and the swimmer and the chest hair thing, that actually goes back. He says that's way too weird and speculative. It's called the aquatic ape hypothesis, and Ingold dismisses it. That's baloney. And he says that, in fact, although we are creatures of the ocean, we actually can't swim very well. We can't survive it. We can't be out there very long without inventing watercraft. And so for much of human history, yes, exactly, Liv, we don't live on the water, we live on land. And our whole assumption has been that societies and politics and our monuments are on the land. But what is really interesting about this is we've had a whole period for about actually the last 500 years. No, yes, at about 500 years ago, maybe 600 or 700, there's the invention of ocean-going vessels. And as Ingold says, this turns the world completely inside out and upside down. And what happens is once you have people traveling around in these ocean-going vessels and sailing ships and stuff like that, the land becomes a barrier to your life. So instead of rivers, and that's why we've dug up all those canals and things, because we wanted to get around the land so we could get to the ocean. The whole point was to get to the ocean and on the ocean. And in that world that came about, we can date it to some of the first transoceanic voyages, then islands become central to your life. And so being on the shore, being on a coastal city, or being on an island was the best thing you could have. And if you were too far inland, if you were in the mountains somewhere, then you were on the periphery of life. And so we had this whole transformation, and it's hard actually for us to imagine what this was like, in which it was prioritized all the coastal, we still have the great coastal cities, but the Caribbean, for example, all those Caribbean islands, they were seen as one of the centers of the world. And that's where you wanted to be. And so, for example, Napoleon, he was going around, well, he was like a land conqueror himself. But one of the things he also had a pretension to was an empire in the Americas. But the key to his empire was what was really the half island of Hispaniola. It was the western side, which was named Saint Domingue, which we now know of as Haiti. But this was the key to the French colonial empire. It was one of the richest colonies there was. It was a massive producer of sugarcane, coffee, tea. It was one of the richest places on earth, of course, and built on enslaved labor. And with the Haitian Revolution, with the overthrow of the colonial society, Napoleon loses interest in his holdings in the Americas and sells the Louisiana Purchase, sells all that land to Thomas Jefferson, for a song. And so we actually owe, in the United States, we owe our whole westward expansion. It probably would have happened anyway, but in the fact that we were able to do it for less money was that we should be grateful to the Haitians for rising up and overthrowing that stupid Napoleon and starting their own country. We are rarely grateful to Haitians in this country. Usually we just try to yell at them and get mad at them for supposedly eating dogs and cats. But we should be grateful to them, because without them, we probably would have not had such an easy Western expansion. But the point of the matter is that the inland, that was useless to people. The point was to be on those islands. Those are the real jewels in the system. And if you listen to artists from the Caribbean islands, There was a singer named Pablo Milanés that I used to listen to, and he expressed this as, I love this island, I'm of the Caribbean. I can never be on firm land because it inhibits me. And so it was this feeling that if you're on an island, that's where you feel free. And if you're on land, you're trapped. And I could never understand this because I grew up in Montana. Talk about a peripheral inland place. And if I feel trapped, if I'm on an island, I feel like I'm surrounded by this terrible ocean water and I can't go anywhere and I'm not free. It's when I'm in a car driving down the road that I actually feel free and uninhibited. But that has to do with our transport system, which I should add in highways too, railways, airways, and being able to drive a car anywhere. Now, water becomes a barrier. Now we need bridges and those kinds of things. And so in this situation, land comes back into the picture, and having a bunch of land is great. And the islands sink back in and become a periphery again. So those Caribbean islands, unless you're going there on vacation, you don't even know about them. In Haiti, nobody ever cares about that. We're always insulting the Haitians and putting them down, and who knows what's going on there. And so these places that were once central have become peripheral again. There's this great passage, though, about how, and Ingold is drawing on other people, this idea that our transportation system is in part what we're doing as a back and forth between the priority of land and the priority of sea. Wait a second. Where'd it go? As the geographer Kenneth Olwig remarks, history itself could be characterized in terms of such changes in the relative predominance of waterborne and landborne infrastructure. So we're currently a little bit perhaps in the land phase. We are in the land phase, but things might change again. What's interesting to me is actually this was expressed in the book Trees Tropique by Claude Lévi-Strauss himself, although Ingold doesn't cite this part, where Lévi-Strauss is going around to all these places that were once, he was going around to coastal cities that were once very prominent, but have now been skipped over by air travel. And he says that there's a lot of strange charm in these places that have been are now left behind by the fact that we skip them over. Interestingly, this book, which is basically a story of his anthropological travels and traveling around to Brazil and other places, begins with a very famous sentence. That's how the book starts and goes on from there. But yeah, it was very French that way. So Ingold then has this passage about how the sea is not level, and that in fact it's all this stuff, these waves that are sloshing around and it's changing all the time. So when we talk about sea levels, it's a strange idea that is an illusion from our cartographic maps. But in this section, it gives us a sense of history that in fact the Holocene, the era we now live in, was a melting time from the last ice age, and that we are survivors of previous inundations. It goes on to say that with climate change, of course, as we all know, that we probably will see a lot more of this, more inundations. And he goes on to talk about how some people think that that's going to be a complete disaster and an apocalypse, and other people think we'll solve it all and create a utopia. But he's saying, well, it's probably not going to be either of those. What he thinks is going to happen, which I thought was super interesting too, one might call it a revelation, is that you have from the year 1700. So if we think about the ocean going times, that was invented, say, about 1500, but 1700, I'm thinking industrial beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So Ingold says it's from the year 1700 to 2100 that it will be seen as a surge and then a crash. And that then, wait a second, what's going to happen after that? So what is going to happen after this surge and crash? So Ingold says here that if it's 1700 to 2100, marked by a seemingly unstoppable surge, followed by an equally calamitous crash, after which it'll be back to business as usual for the human species, albeit in a world that could take millennia to recover from the event's impact. Yeah, basically Waterworld. We'll be just doing things. It'll just be like Waterworld. We'll have to all be navigating a new and different world. But Ingold says it's not going to be that different. And he says the people who are going to tell us this will be the chroniclers of 1,000 years from now, if there are such. Is that what he said, or I'm misquoting him? Chroniclers of 1,000 years from now, if there are such, will look back. Yeah, this isn't very optimistic about the chroniclers. If there are such, there might not be many books around. So that is true. The books, I was a history major in college, and one of my history professors said that the book has a very specific time period, and she told us that we were nearing the end of it. But now I just walk around listening to Ingold on Alexa. Ingold loves books too, by the way, so I'm sure this makes him sad as well. I was also thinking about this. In 2100, some of you may still be around 2100. But I'll be able to tell you what seems to be happening.
Your location and time?
Oh, going back to the original question about yeah, I used to think that it was useless to live past, say, 85. I did believe that. In fact, my wife and I once agreed that if we made it to 85, we would immediately start smoking. But finally, I get it. The stuff I've been reading, though, and I'm not just saying this because I'm an old man, I'm saying the stuff I've been reading, though, seems to indicate that obviously, yes, there are a lot of health risks and you don't want to screw things up, but there are people in their 90s who live by themselves and lead quite active lives and are mentally sharp. So I don't think I'm going to start smoking at 85 anymore, but we'll see what the world is like then. Give us something to do. Yeah, exactly. So, but the point of the matter is, Waterworld, you might still be here, and the world might be, we might be in a different place, and back to business, we'll all be mariners and going around doing our mariner thing. Maybe not able to carry that many books with us. That is true. So, one of Ingold's big points, revelations, you might say, in this chapter is the land, although we think of land as a container or as a continent system that contains it, is not really a container. I thought that was very important. And so this that we are in a cycle of the oceans are swirling up and raining down, and the rivers run out, and the runoff from our agriculture runs out. And then he makes a whole parallel, which I thought was quite interesting too, between our ideas about the land as a container, but we also have these ideas about the container ship, that everything is supposed to be contained on these container ship. But as Ingold puts it, they're belching out greenhouse gases as they go across the ocean. And he says that they're always turning over and all these little things are floating around and out to sea, and at the rate of 4 a day, we lose container ships. Obviously, this happened after Ingold wrote this chapter, but the whole North Carolina flooding. Here you have a hurricane that was supposed to hit Florida, and it did hit Florida, kind of, but then barrels up in through the middle of North Carolina and floods these mountain towns. And these were places where people had left to escape climate change. And so it was like when here a couple years ago, when the wildfire smoke came in. Yeah, you weren't supposed to, the air quality went very bad. This would go well with Ingold's, like, our roads and our pavement are supposed to be there for us. They're supposed to be permanent. The earth is moving and it's always messing us up. That's the problem. It's becoming very, very difficult to buy insurance in some of these places because, so yeah, there are ways in which these places become harder and harder to inhabit, but it more requires a different way of life. We just have to mariner this thing out.
Is there a specific type of houseboat that you would recommend?
I was surprised that nobody got into that whole comparison between a surfboard and the people on a cruise ship. It might be the most famous surfer photo ever. What's the deal? In order to build a building, what do we have to do? Excavation. You have to excavate it. Even though the architects don't want to admit it, they just want to draw that thing that, as if it's sitting on the ground. It's not that they have nothing to do with it, but the point is that the architect is just supposed to design the thing that's above the ground.
They even take archaeology, guys, it's not my fault.
So you have to dig into the ground, and then the problem is that the ground, well, the earth, it keeps moving. It might fall in and does all these things. And so it takes a lot to keep that earth together. Every library that I've ever been to, at some point, somebody tells me that they point at the library and they say, yeah, this library is sinking into the earth. And they say the reason is that the architect, when they designed the library, didn't think about the weight of the books. And so it's slowly sinking down. Now, I don't know if this has ever actually happened, but I've been told it's happened about every line now. It's become an urban legend. Well, what happened to this church? This is in Paris a long time ago that this was built and it's standing there, but then the stuff they built around it made it so the ground became more and more unstable. So now they've put it on these concrete foundations and the earth can just move under it. So you can still go there and do all your tourist things. I looked it up. You can do the touristy stuff there, but the earth is moving beneath it. Actually, the anthropologist who studied this did a museum exhibit with another, it was in Paris and it was in French, but I don't understand French. It was called Is Paris Floating? And it was all about all these places in Paris that are, if you go underground, it is more like an island or a whole city on stilts. Is Paris floating? As a Paris revealed as a lakeside city built on stilts. So that makes me want to go to Paris. So what should we do? What instead? How should we do this? The Aquapelago. Yeah, it would be more than Earth sky. It would be Earth ocean sky, and we'd be traversing this place. You said that this was a game.
Just float around on this raft, and that's it.
So, yeah, you can probably learn a lot from this game. I was thinking in terms of the stuff that is close to water and before the year 2100. And I don't want anybody to get hurt, but it really would be poetic justice if over the next few years, this place disappeared under the waves. Yes, it is. This is Mar-a-Lago, which we basically, and this is where all the White House stuff is happening now. Trump's down there more than he is in DC, which DC itself might disappear too into the ocean. But yeah, that would be terrible. But I think that there would be a poetic justice to this, because if there's one person who has this illusion of permanence and building and the whole idea of that is the anti-mariner, you might say, the anti-nomad, it would be this person who owns Mar-a-Lago and is down there all the time. So I was thinking, well, how probable is it that this is going to be swept into some hurricane? And I have to say, I looked at this on Google Maps, and it is true there's some land on either side of it, but man, oh man, I don't want anybody in West Palm Beach to be hurt by this, but come on, we just need to let nature do what the ocean does, what the ocean does.